Well, we're going to start another week of devotions. I want to ask if you've been watching, if you wouldn't mind just clicking like or leaving a comment. I'd love to know who this is reaching, who it's helping, who is with me every morning, and that encourages me to keep going and know that it is being effective and blessing people. We're going to be looking at Luke chapter 15 in preparation for this coming Sunday. And one of the most well-known and favorite passages for people that go to church and people that don't go to church. And it's the parable of the prodigal son, right? The son who goes and just spends all his dad's inheritance for him on wild living, and then eventually comes to a senses and comes back home. But today we're going to just look at the first two verses. And I'm going to try to keep these within 6 minutes, and call it 6 at 6, because I've been posting them at 6 in the morning. So I'm going to try to see if I can limit it to about 6 minutes every day. So 15 verses 1 and 2. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And then verse 3, the first line there, then Jesus told them this parable. So the next three parables that come and follow are coming because of these first two verses, where it says that Jesus was there. There were two groups of people. You had the Pharisees, that were the religious leaders, the morally right people. They're the ones you look at and say they're following God's law. They're not living in just open rebellious sin. And then you had the tax collectors and sinners. The sinners being those who didn't go to church, they didn't go to synagogue, they weren't living a morally right life. You probably would not see them Saturday mornings in synagogue. And then it mentions the tax collectors. And tax collectors are often mentioned as like a pariah, or those rejected, those that as bad people. And not just because, like today's tax collectors who work for the IRS, they were traitors to their own people. They were usurping and stealing from their own people, serving the Romans and serving Herod. They would extort money from their own people and give some to Herod, give the portion to the Romans, and then keep some for themselves. So they were seen as traitors. So they're gathering around Jesus. They're drawn to Jesus. The sinners, the tax collectors, are drawn to him. They are coming out to see him. And Jesus is going, and they're inviting Jesus into their home. And he's accepting the invitation and going and eating and having meals with the disciples. And this is what, or with the sinners, and this is what the Pharisees are like, how they're muttering, how can he do this? Because they would not do this. So what was it about Jesus that drew them? Because we're supposed to be following Jesus' example. And are people who are lost, people who are what the Bible would call sinners, are they drawn to us? Because they were drawn to Christ. Well, why were they drawn to Christ? Was it because he was telling them what they wanted to hear? Yes, he was. Okay, because in the previous chapter that we just looked at, following that this follows out of, Jesus is telling them two different times, when you invite people into your home, don't just invite your friends. Invite those that are the lame, the crippled, the hurting, the blind, the poor. Invite them. And then he says, there was a man who had a banquet, and he ends up inviting those who are in the streets, those who are in the byways and the highways, and he says specifically again, the lame, the crippled, the poor. So he's letting them know, hey, you're invited. God is making a way. God is opening up the kingdom of heaven, because they understood that in those parables, they were the lame and the poor and the crippled, and that's who they were. And they were understanding that Jesus is communicating to them, the door is open to you. You can come into the kingdom. But it wasn't because, and obviously you don't think they wanted to hear that? Absolutely they wanted to hear that. But it wasn't just that, because he didn't water it down. In chapter 13, he says, right, unless you repent, you too will perish. And then in chapter 14, right after those parables about the invitation, he says, if you do not give up everything, and he doesn't say it to one group or the other, but to everyone that's there, if you don't give up everything to follow me, you cannot be my disciple. So he's telling them the kingdom of heaven is open. The door is open to you. But He doesn't water it down, right? He's letting them know but it's going to cost you everything to be my disciple. So if the message that Jesus was communicating, even though he didn't water it down, they were still responding to or drawn to, then it's not just the message that was drawing them, but it's the messenger also. The message and the messenger are intertwined. And you're the messenger. I'm the messenger. The church is the messenger, and we have the message. So the church, the messenger, and the message are intertwined. Because when they would go to the synagogues and they would hear the law and the teaching, you just know the Pharisees would give them looks, right? They look at them up and down, sideways, and when Jesus, however, would go and talk to them, they could see in his eyes and hear in his tone the love and compassion he has for them. It reminds me of the story of David Wilkerson, who I think in the 60s goes to New York City because of a burden for the gang members and the youth in New York City. This Pennsylvania preacher goes to New York, and the story is a true story of how he is preaching, and one of the gang members, one of the notorious gang members, Nicky Cruz, yells at him and storms off and tells his gang, "Let's come on, follow me." And they go into a basement to one of their pads, and they're partying, the music's on, and they're doing drugs. And about 15 minutes later, David Wilkerson walks in, and he says, and he walks up to Nicky, and Nicky says, "You better stop right there, or I'll take my .32 revolver and I'll blow your brains out." And David Wilkerson kept walking and stuck his hand out and says, he says, "Come on, Nicky, shake my hand." And instead of shaking his hand, he pushed it away, pushed him up against the wall, and started slapping him and punching him. His guys pull him off and tell him, "Nicky, what are you doing? This is a preacher. This is a minister." Well, a couple of weeks later, they're invited to a meeting where David Wilkerson invited the gangs because he wants to preach to them. And Nicky tells his own story where he says that at night, David Wilkerson was praying for him. And he says, this man was just weeping. And when I heard his broken heart and his tears, I could feel his heart beating. I just was overcome. And I turned to look. I was about to take off because I didn't know how to process it. And I looked, and all my friends were all on the ground crying out to Jesus. So what was it that made the difference? Was it the message in itself? Nicky didn't even want to hear the message. But the message was exemplified, demonstrated through the messenger. And eventually the combination of the message of the gospel and the messenger living it out made the difference in Nicky's life. So let's be that. Let's be the message lived out in the messenger. And we'll continue this tomorrow, so stay tuned, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow. Don't forget to just make a comment and like the video so that I know that you're out there and you're watching, and keep them coming. Okay, God bless you.